You might think a port is just a place where steel and containers pile up, a boring node on the global trade chain. But on today's geopolitical chessboard, whoever controls the choke points of the global supply chain is even the ability to move military power around the world. Chinese companies now fully or partially control around 95 ports worldwide. Across Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas, companies from the United States operate only a handful of major overseas ports. The number gap is huge, and behind it is a question that makes many people in the West nervous. If your rival can refuel and supply ships in almost any region on Earth, how long can your own fleet stay dominant? When China launched the Belt and Road Initiative in the year 2013, there were two very different reactions. The optimistic camp said this is a historic chance for Chinese companies to go global. The pessimistic camp said this is a government lead. Money-burning project that will never pay back. 10 years later, the data is in. More than $1 billion United States dollars have gone into global infrastructure, and ports have turned out to be some of the strongest performing assets in that plan. Three Chinese groups sit at the center of this port network: China Ocean Shipping Group, China Merchants Port, and Hutchison Ports. Their business model sounds very simple: buy stakes in overseas ports or acquire them outright, secure long-term operating rights, then turn unused terminals into busy, efficient hubs. But behind that simple description is a very powerful flywheel. The port of Piraeus in Greece shows how this works. It used to be close to bankruptcy, and when China Ocean Shipping Group stepped in around 2016, many people in Europe saw it as a distressed asset. Container volumes multiplied several times over, and Piraeus became one of the leading ports in the Mediterranean region. What changed was not the geography the port is in the same place, but capital management and network effects. Once a port is plugged into a global network that can direct shipping lines, logistics partners, and cargo owners, throughput can go fast. More ships call at the port, more services cluster around it, and suddenly a struggling terminal becomes a regional hub. The key here is scale. When you control important nodes at both ends of the Suez Canal, along the Malacca Strait, and at gateways in the Mediterranean and North Sea, shipping lines almost have to call at your ports. And because China is the largest owner of cargo in the world, it can steer even more traffic to those locations. In the year 2022, China's total imports and exports passed $6 trillion United States dollars, about 13% of global trade, in ports where Chinese operators are in charge. Ships linked to Chinese trade can often get earlier berthing slots, slightly better rates, and faster customs clearance. This is not some secret privilege. It is the commercial reward for bringing more business to the terminal and for helping local authorities hit their own economic targets. But the deeper advantage is in the data: every container's origin and destination, every route's cargo volume, every product's seasonal pattern. Put all of that together and you get a live, extremely detailed picture of global trade. Imagine the companies. One company in Europe or the United States is looking at customs statistics that are 1 or 2 months old, trying to guess demand for the next quarter. The other company is tied into real-time port and shipping data. It can see today that certain routes are getting fuller, certain commodities are slowing down, and certain destinations are heating up. Who will make better decisions about buying iron, nor booking ships, or financing inventory? That information gap can be turned into real money in commodity purchasing, in freight pricing, in supply chain finance, and in decisions about where to place factories and warehouses. Here is the paradox. The more money ports make, the more sensitive they look from a strategic point of view. Strong earnings prove how important control really is, so ports are no longer just business assets, they're also treated as security assets. In a commercial world, a port is valued by its throughput, its efficiency, and its return on investment. Analysts build discounted cash flow models, they estimate future volumes, and they try to put a number on the expected profit. In the national security world, the same port is valued by very different things: how much control it gives over a trade route, how easily it can support military logistics and fuel supply, and how much intelligence can be gathered from its data systems. Those two valuation systems smashed into each other during the global coronavirus pandemic in the year 2020. Supply chains were in chaos. On the west coast of the United States, ports like Los Angeles and Long Beach were more congested than ever. Hundreds of ships waited at anchor for weeks. Some vessels waited outside for more than 20 days, with enormous costs building up every single hour. In that kind of crisis, governments realized something very uncomfortable. Legal ownership is one thing, operational control is another. It is not just about who owns the land, it is about who runs the terminals, who maintains the software, who provides the cranes, and who can decide in practice which ships get priority. That is also why a proposed deal in Long Beach that involved a Chinese operator was blocked in the year 2017. On paper it looked like commercial politics, but underneath it revealed something deeper. Ports can have one price in the business world and a very different price in the national security world. At almost the same time, another concern appeared: equipment. More than 80% of the giant ship-to-shore cranes imports in the United States come from one Chinese manufacturer. Each crane costs millions of US dollars, and each one is packed with sensors and control systems, even if no one is actually misusing that data. The idea that a foreign supplier might be able to see real-time information on every container that passes through a critical port is enough to worry defense planners. So in recent years, the Department of Defense in the United States has quietly reviewed those systems, and the national budget has set aside over $1 billion to start replacing Chinese-made equipment with machines from other suppliers. From a pure business angle, this makes little sense. The existing cranes work well, they are not cheap, but they are reasonably priced, and the after-sales service is proven. Replacing them means spending much more money for the same basic function, but from a risk angle, the calculation is completely different. If a serious conflict ever breaks out, or if relations between major powers break down, the cost of failure in a few critical ports might not be measured in lost fees, but in broken supply lines and stranded military assets. This is the new logic for pricing ports. Companies still build discounted cash flow models, but governments ask, if we lose operational control, here in the worst case, what is the cost? Once that worst case cost is put into numbers, ports stop being purely commercial projects and start to look like bargaining chips in a long, slow geopolitical game. You can also see this tension in Hamburg in Germany. In the year 2022, China Ocean Shipping Group offered to buy a minority stake in one of Hamburg's main container terminals. The price was not high, but roughly one-third of Hamburg's container traffic comes from China. If a Chinese state-linked company became a major shareholder there, it could influence how cargo is routed and distributed across Europe. For the Chinese side, the main payoff was not the dividend, it was the ability to plug a German gateway port into its own global network and offer end-to-end services from factories in China to warehouses and assembly plants in Europe. Think about German manufacturers, especially car makers. Every year they import millions of parts from China. Ships, engines, battery modules, electronic components. A stable, one-stop route from Chinese ports to German assembly lines is worth a lot of money to them. If a logistics provider can guarantee capacity, predictable transit times, and integrated customs and trucking, those manufacturers are willing to pay a premium for reliability. At the same time, officials in Berlin worried that if China held a key stake in Hamburg, port operations might one day be used as a bargaining chip in a trade dispute. This is not just imagination. In the year 2019, after Australia publicly called for an investigation into the origin of the COVID, China sharply reduced imports of Australian coal. The result was billions of US dollars in Australia and a very clear warning to any country that is highly dependent on a single buyer. In that kind of situation, port equity does not work like a hammer, it works like a cloud of uncertainty hanging over every future negotiation. In the end, the German government chose a middle path. The Chinese company received just under one-quarter of the terminal instead of the larger stake it originally wanted. That was enough to have some influence on operations, but not enough to trigger a full political confrontation at the level of the European Union. It was a compromise between security concerns and business sides, and it sent a very clear signal to German industry for now. Economic interests in the Chinese markets don't matter more than abstract security risks. While all of this is happening, the United States and the European Union are pushing large plans to rebuild critical parts of their supply chains at home or in friendly countries. There are subsidy programs for semiconductor factories, for batteries, for critical raw materials, and for new energy technologies. On the surface, these are industrial policies to support jobs and innovation. In reality, they all point to the same goal: regaining control over KISA and reducing vulnerability to external shocks. In this restructuring, ports have turned from neutral infrastructure into a blind spot of supply chain sovereignty. The strategy from Washington is straightforward. If it cannot quickly build a global port network to match China's, it will use finance and political conditions to shape where future cargo goes. So you see loans and development funds flowing into ports in India, into terminals in Southeast Asia, and into projects in Latin America and Eastern Europe, often with one key condition written into the contract: no Chinese operators, no Chinese equipment, or no Chinese equity stakes. China's response has been to deepen and digitalize its own network. Chinese port groups are investing tens of billions of US dollars to upgrade automation and data systems in dozens of overseas ports, turning scattered assets into one integrated network that can reroute ships in real time. If one port is jammed due to weather, strikes, or accidents, the system can recommend another port in the same group where capacity is available, and then automatically coordinate trucking and rail connections behind it. That kind of flexibility is something a single standalone port operator simply cannot match. Under the surface, capital markets have already started to reprice all of this. Rating agencies have downgraded the credit ratings of several European port operators, explicitly citing higher geopolitical risk and more uncertainty in asset values. That means investors are now baking political risk directly into their commercial models. One direct result is that Chinese companies face higher borrowing costs for overseas port acquisitions. Their financing is more expensive, their deals are more heavily scrutinized, and some projects simply do not pass the new risk filters. Western companies, even when their expected project returns are lower, can sometimes access cheaper capital because they are seen as safer from a political standpoint. The endgame of this contest is not one side completely winning and the other side completely losing. The more likely outcome is a fragmented reorganization of global supply chains. Over time, the world may slowly split into two main logistics systems. One system will be centered on China, linked to parts of Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. The other system will be centered on the United States and Europe, linked to Latin America, India, Eastern Europe, and other regions. Inside each system, efficiency can still be very high. Ships will run on time, warehouses will be automated, and data will flow smoothly. But moving goods between the two systems will become more complicated and more expensive. For multinational companies, that means building far more redundancy into their supply chains. The same critical part may need suppliers in both systems. Inventories will need to be higher and risk buffers will need to be thicker. Logistics costs are likely to stay permanently higher than before, maybe by 15%, maybe by 20%, depending on the industry. From the turnaround of Piraeus to the shareholding debate in Hamburg, from equipment reviews in ports of the United States to the slow fragmentation of global supply chains, the fight over who controls structure shows the new business logic of the second half of globalization. Infrastructure is no longer just a neutral commercial asset. It has become a hidden junction where economic security and supply chains are meant to meet. China has spent about a decade and enormous sums of money building a port network that is commercially efficient and strategically flexible. The United States and its partners are now trying to restore balance through politics, finance, and alliances. As more and more countries put supply chain security above cost optimization, the efficiency gains of the last 40 years of globalization will slowly fade. Companies will pay more for the same logistics services. Consumers will pay more for the same products. And that extra bill will show up in every quarterly earnings report and in every family-ass shopping cart. In a game where there are no real winners, the only certainty is that the cost curve of global trade is being permanently rewritten by geopolitics.